All right, chapter 16. We're going to talk about trash. Fun, right? No? Well, let's try. Okay, so waste generation, terrestrial pollution, and waste disposal. So I'm going to try to break this down by the modules best I can for these lectures. Okay, so first of all, we are the only organisms that generate waste, like actual trash. Other organisms that generate waste, like poop and things like that, it gets recycled eventually. Okay. But we generate waste that cannot be used or reused. So, our definition of waste is anything that is no longer useful or can no longer be consumed. In municipal solid waste, you're going to see this a lot, MSW, that this is solid waste that is collected from, like, small businesses, restaurants, homes, as well as larger institutions like schools and stuff. And we produce so much waste that we can actually consider this to be a system because there are so many inputs and outputs. So speaking of inputs and outputs, so whenever we're talking about this, and the inputs would be things like those raw materials, what we put into it. We use and we reuse products as best we can. Well, some of us do. And then at the end, we do end up with waste that has to be disposed of. It cannot be recycled. Some of it cannot be recycled. Some of it can no longer be reused. And so that is the output. That's what ends up with the dump. That's where it's what we can no longer process. MSW has become more and more prevalent, not just here in the United States, but worldwide. This graph here specifically shows the United States and how we are producing more trash every year. And a lot of that is because we are considered to what they call a throwaway society. That term, throwaway society, kind of comes from the fact that we use a lot of single-use plastics, single-use materials, cups, paper products, things like that. So because of that, we're known as a throwaway society. But also, another major factor of this is electronics. You may have heard your grandparents say, well, back in the day, they made things to last. Well, yeah, they did. Now, not so much. So even big electronics, phones, TVs, computers, major pieces of equipment are meant to have a lifespan and to be disposed of after a certain number of years, because then the technology is probably going to be finite. It's not going to be as relevant as it once was. It's going to be outdated. So that's another aspect of this when we'll talk about kind of hazardous waste later on, that this comes into this as into play as well. So the solid waste stream contains materials from all sorts of places. It's things that have been recycled and reused. It could be the end source, the end location for things that had to have been incinerated and burned, or just, dumped in the landfill, compiled from, bulk trash pickups and clippings for yards and stuff like that as well. These graphs are pretty interesting. I like these graphics. They are located on page 578 of your book. And these show you a lot of cool information on these. So the top one shows you that in the United States, where the most of our trash source comes from. And then it also shows you how much of it is compostable, meaning that you can use it, resource it, and it'll break down into soil eventually. But if you look, we had a lot of paper that we use, a lot of paper and a lot of plastic. And down here in the lower left, it shows the total recovered. The recovered are resources that we can go back and we can recover after it's been disposed and try to resource it, reuse it, recycle it, rework it. So some of that are things like food scraps, yard waste, that kind of stuff. But again, look at it. Paper, that's the big one. And then the last one on the lower right down here, the total discarded. So the total discarded is obviously going to be more than what we were able to recover. And again, that's paper, a lot of it plastics, things that in your head, you're like, oh, can't that be recycled? Some of it can, some of it can't. And we'll talk about that too. E-waste. So this kind of goes back to the throwaway society concept. So anytime you have an electronic device, it could even be a rechargeable battery, earbuds, anything that contains any type of electronic wiring, it is considered to be e-waste. And it's not much of the overall percentage of waste. However, it has a huge impact. And the reason why is because e-waste contains toxic metals, heavy metals, but then also too, it could, like the battery packs can leak and, leak battery acid and could react with other things that are also tossed away in the dump. And it does not break down on its own. So those parts and those pieces need to be separated very often and then recycled properly. It's expensive to do so. A lot of municipalities don't offer this. San Antonio does, but it's a lot of small towns and areas like that. They can't offer it. So it can be a challenge to properly dispose of this. Okay, so let's talk about composting. We referred to it a little bit earlier in Module 51, where we were talking about how we have, we can take some of the trash, some of what's discarded, the refuse, the waste, and compost it. So let's talk about what that exactly means. So to compost means to reuse, reduce, and recycle. And you're thinking compost meaning just like a compost pile in the backyard. Well, just wait. So these are known as the 3 R's, right? You've heard of this since like second grade. Reduction of materials and waste is absolutely the most important thing to do. It is the optimal way to really help us achieve less waste production, not just in our country, but around the world. And one of the ways that we can do this is we can kind of help reduce the amount of waste that's made from planning and the preparation of other things. So whenever you get like whatever the leftover plastics that are not used whenever they make plastic bottles. So those kinds of source reductions, being able to utilize that resource better, more efficiently, and get more use out of it rather than having to throw away a certain amount of it. It can also be more energy efficient, because then you're literally throwing away less stuff, but then you're also paying for less of that material to begin with. And 2, you're probably not you're going to be exposed to less and fewer toxic chemicals, products, plastics, all of that kind of stuff, because if you're using less, then you're coming into contact with less. Reusing materials is another thing that can be very useful for helping us to limit the amount of waste that is produced. Reusing it just simply means using it again. Sometimes you will be able to reuse it in a different way. You may not be able to reuse it in its original form that as you used it the first time or first few times. However, you may be able to repurpose it. So that could be great. And because of this, then you're not using extra energy, you're not using extra resources, but it's a great way to limit some amount of trash production. And then recycling. So recycling is what you guys know. We have recycle bins, and you throw certain objects away into them, and what the expectation is that they are going to be reworked, recycled, resold, and then put back out into reused in some way, right? Well, that's the concept. Now, how much of that really occurs? There's a lot of variables that depend on that. So, but the recycling process, there's two types of recycling. There's what we call closed loop recycling. And so that would be like aluminum cans. So aluminum cans, you can break down that, you can melt down the aluminum and reprint them into more aluminum cans several times. Open loop recycling is one where that you would take things like plastic bottles and then rework it into a fabric or into a different like a plastic source for signs or something like that. So open loop recycling is referring to the fact that you're actually going to create a different product out from the original source. So this picture here just kind of shows you how that would be an example of this. It's in your book. Luckily, we are getting much more efficient at recycling, especially here in the United States and in Europe. Europe is doing a bang-up job at it, more so than we are, but we are doing better and better with this concept, and people are buying into the fact that it is a good way to help us limit the amount of waste that's dumped into dumps and landfills. So composting is the form where you're really more thinking about, we're going to throw our leftover vegetables and mix them with some dead leaves and we get dirt, soil. So yeah, that's the basic definition. So organic materials that can be broken down and separated and kind of broken down into soil at some point. Well, that's good, because then you can basically make your own soil, right? Your own fertilizer, your own soil amendments to work into your gardens. But something that you don't really think about is that all of the leftover produce stuff, organic matter that gets thrown into the landfills, it actually produces high levels of methane gas in that ripening and that decomposition process. So removing it from the big landfills is good. If you can do it on your own, it kind of helps negate some of that heat that's produced from the methane being released and those processes from going on. But the technical process of composting itself is what's going on is you take these organic materials and you are giving them an environment in which sometimes you'll use worms, you can use other organisms, you can just let it work down on its own slowly. But what it does is it will create a soil-like texture material. And it depends on what you're composting and what ratios of things you're composting. So you could do things such as the ends of your vegetables whenever you chop up vegetables, like your cucumber peels and things like that. You can use some of your dried crunch up leaves that you had to rake, some of your grass from when you mowed. You can also use some cardboards, some cereal boxes, things like that. Some of that stuff can also be composted, newspapers. So some of that stuff can be broken down fairly easily and fairly quickly. You need to have a general idea as to the process of composting. This picture that's in your book is much more of an industrialized version of not something you would have in your backyard. Like, look, Mom, look at my new composting project. No, just kidding. So they mix it in these drums, and these drums do a couple of different things. It screens out some of the big stuff that they don't want in there. But then too, it just kind of puts it all, makes a good solid mixture of it, and you don't have just lumps of certain things that they dumped off. Then the compostable material is aerated, which means that it's exposed to air, and they'll go and they'll turn it over. They'll flip it and expose it to air, and that helps those microbes that are in there respire more efficiently and more quickly. And it depends on what the materials are. Some materials will break down in a couple of weeks. Some materials take a year, 2 years, depending on what it's made out of. If it's really fibrous, like cellulose, it takes a lot longer than, say, a carrot peel. So, yeah. So, and then we let it cure. And as we let it cure, that kind of lets some of the moisture out. It makes it easier to transport because it's not going to weigh as less and things like that. Then once it's done, it's usually put in big trucks, bagged, or you can go purchase it in bulk as well. All right, I'm going to end the first mini lesson lecture there.